But there is an aspect to being an anesthesiologist. What we do, it's a performance. Everybody's watching us. You only have a few minutes to get the intubation or, to resuscitate the patient. And so, I always joke that my life has been defined by these 4 minutes on the ice, skating, or like literally 4 minutes until something bad may happen to my patient if I don't intervene within that 4 minutes. You always hear that, oh my God, my whole life is on this 4 minute timeline. Like if I don't perform within 4 minutes, bad things happen. But that's sort of just the frame of reference.
Welcome to another episode of California Society of Anesthesiologists Vital Times podcast. This is Dr. Ludwig Lin. Today is part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Antonio Conte, the new president of the CSA. In this episode, we talk about Dr. Conte's origin story, his journey toward becoming a cardiac anesthesiologist, his political advocacy, and, most importantly, his lifelong love of figure skating. We're thrilled to have Dr. Conte. And in addition to that, this being June, it's a wonderful way for the CSA to emphasize its commitment to Pride Month and the LGBTQ population. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to try to sort of step back, but also make this germane to each listening Californian anesthesiologist out there. How can the stereotypical, average, overstretched Californian anesthesiologist participate and help in all these advocacy efforts that the CSA is doing, both in the community level and also at the state and national level? Do you have any thoughts, advice, recommendations?
Sure, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that, Dr. Lin. So I think, first of all, just being a member of the California Society of Anesthesiologists or American Society of Anesthesiologists is a key step and probably the most important step in being, a participating, engaged member, because your membership dollars go to a lot of different activities. They fund a lot of the efforts that CSA and ASA, you know, participates in and tries to provide, value and service for their members. So I think that's a really big, just it seems so basic, like just belonging to CSA and ASA and being an engaged member is number one first step. But and I realize a lot of people are super busy, they can't get away or they can't step out and go to meetings. But a lot of times both the CSA and or the ASA will send out an email and it'll be, a big advocacy alert, like a big grassroots. Please reach out to your state assembly member, senator, or your congressional member at the federal level. And there's usually a hyperlink that takes you to a standardized letter, and you pretty much just have to fill in your name, your email, and where you work and where you live, and that'll generate a letter of support for a particular issue that the CSA or the ASA is doing. It sounds incredibly easy, but it's hard to believe how hard it is to get people to do it, and it just takes a few minutes. And just by sending in those letters to the assembly members, the legislators, it means a lot because they start keeping track of all the responses that come in support or opposition to a particular bill or a particular issue. And that you can just do from wherever you are at work, in between breaks, or at home when you get home and you're checking your email. And to be frank, a lot of our advocacy, it's really just done like that. It's just by soliciting the grassroots sort of engagement, on that very first step of sending a letter out. Now, a lot of times the CSA will sort of send out a blast that say, hey, we're meeting with a state senator right in your backyard, and they're going to be attending an event at a park, in, let's say, Los Angeles. And so we'd love it if you could show up, represent the California Society of Anesthesiologists. So there's a lot of local events that we have, whether they be dinners or whether they be events that are sponsored by a particular legislator that you can come, show up. You don't really even have to do anything other than make yourself present, introduce yourself, mingle with the crowd, and just sort of, let everyone know who you are and why you're there. And like I said, a big part of being engaged is just simply visibility. So I think that's a really, really important thing that if you have the time, it'd be great if we could, kind of ask our members to do. One of the ironically good things that has come out of the COVID pandemic is a lot of the meetings we used to be in person in Sacramento, and those meetings have now been sort of supplanted by Zoom meetings. So rather than traveling to Sacramento for meetings with state assembly members or senators, we now can do it from just about anywhere. So, like, once again, if there is a meeting that needs to be held, and you're able to squeeze out half an hour in the afternoon or evening for a meeting, Zoom is probably one of the most best, devices that we've now been able to use to engage in our advocacy efforts. And, it's really transformed the way we can do effective lobbying and legislative activity now because it's not so time consuming and it's really convenient for everybody. So I think those three things are three simple steps. You don't need to be an elected officer. You don't need to have a title. You don't have to, travel out of town. And so just kind of pay attention to the emails and the asks that come out from either the CSA or ASA. And those little contributions, they really, really go a long way. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, certainly all of this legislative activity, lobbying, caucus participation, it is funded by our gas pack, which is our political fund. And so contributions to those gas pack funds are not tax deductible. They're political contributions, and we contribute to everyone. We always like to say we're not red, we're not blue, we just work for you. So that's pretty much how it works, both with CSA and ASA. And so once again, just a small contribution every year of even $100, it goes a long way. It's what makes these advocacy and lobbying activities possible. So that's my plug for Gas Pack and the ASA Pack.
Sounds good. I do think that it's really important for all of us to really think about how we each, as a individual anesthesiologist, can and need to contribute to the sustainable, career arcs that we plan to have when we came into the specialty and into medicine. I think the days of assuming that you'll just have a really smooth ride through your career are probably done. Things are turbulent, and all of us need to sort of be willing to be proactive and do something to help shape it. At the same time, the nice thing is I think anesthesiologists are sort of programmed to be proactive. We don't just kind of hang out. So, this is something that we can all do.
Absolutely. I mean, I always like to think that the A for anesthesiology stands for advocacy, right? And so, anesthesiologists have to be able, affable, affordable, and certainly we have to be advocates. So I think it just is one more A for us to do.
I like it. I like that a lot. I wanted to ask you one more question about the political advocacy aspects. How did you get started on this?
Oh boy, now you're really going to be taking me back quite a number of years. So prior to, yeah, prior to my arriving in California in 2008, I was the CEO and co-founder of a anesthesia practice in South Florida that grew to be quite a large group. And so during my tenure there, I was fairly involved with the Florida Society of Anesthesiologists and was one of the kind of key members of a working group that helped bring in certified anesthesiology assistants to the state of Florida. So I sort of started to cut my teeth in that political legislative world, basically trying to improve access to care. We were short of CRNAs, we were short of anesthesiologists in Florida, and so we really looked to a glide path legislatively to bring in certified anesthesiology assistants. So when I came to California, it started my job. I sort of sat quiet for a little while. I was a little invisible. And I happened to be working at Cedars-Sinai alongside Karen Seibert, Dr. Karen Seibert, who was a past president of the CSA. And every
Ah,
once in a while, she'd tap me on my shoulder and say, "Hey, I've got something you might be interested in getting involved in." And so I became a delegate for District 6 in Los Angeles in the geographic district. And then next thing you know, I'm the district director. And then there was the chair of LPAD, the Legislative Practice Affairs Division, Dr. Jeff Pogue. He really needed to move up to assume the president-elect position and ultimately the presidency. And so they were looking for an LPAD chair. And so I went and interviewed with our Committee on Leadership Development nominations. And they were like, "Hey, by any chance, would you want to be the LPAD chair? Because we heard you used to do a lot of political work when you were in Florida." And I was like, "Really? I'm not, I've never even been the chair of legislative affairs. I haven't been the chair of practice management. And you want me to sort of hyper drive right into being chair of both committees and overseeing that?" And they were like, "Yeah, you can do it. You're not a spring chicken anymore. Like, you've been around the block a few times." So, Dave Butler had a conversation with Dr. Karen Seibert and Dr. Sam Wald, and they were like, "Yeah, it's going to be you. Okay." I was like, "Okay." And, luckily I had a great mentor in Dr. Jeff Pogue, who had just done a phenomenal job for about 5 years being LPAD chair. And then the next thing you knew, COVID hit. And so I basically changed, the way we had to do LPAD activity into this Zoom world. And that's what I inherited. And so now that's the legacy I leave behind, is that we pivoted to this very electronic Zoom type world where we're a lot more efficient. So that's how, that's sort of been, the path for me into all of this legislative and advocacy work. And then lo and behold, Cole Dan tapped me on the shoulders and said, "We think it's time for you to move into the president-elect position, and we're going to, nominate you for the House of Delegates to approve as our next president-elect." So that's how it happened. It seemed like it started just yesterday, but I guess I arrived in Los Angeles in 2008, so it's been about 15 years. So it just goes by really fast. So little by little, step by step, just kind of became a little bit bigger player and just started taking on bigger responsibilities along the way until one day here I am.
cool. Sounds great. Let's go back even further. If you could share with our audience a little bit more about y- your life, your background, and how you chose medicine, and how did you then wind up going to anesthesiology and cardiac anesthesiology as your profession? Let's hear.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So first of all, I'm multicultural. My father is Mexican American, my mother is Italian Ethiopian, and so they actually met while my father was a U.S. service member stationed in Ethiopia. So I was born overseas in Ethiopia. I was an Ethiopian citizen, and having a Navy father, we learned to live all over the world, speak different languages, basically moved every 2 to 3 years to a different base. So really just kind of had a very broad perspective on how small the world is and how, honestly, how, similar we all are, just despite a lot of our cultural differences. We're really all the same at the root of it. But pretty early on, I, manifested an interest in science and just sort of started tracking, towards the sciences. And while I was in college, I thought I was going to be a dentist, to be honest with you. And, my best friend's father was a cardiologist, and I spent a weekend with them doing some observership. And he was like, "You don't want to be a dentist. You want to be a doctor. You want to be a physician. There's so many different opportunities, and there's so much, it's like if you're a dentist, you're just going to work in someone's mouth all day long, but you should be a physician. There's like 30 different things you can go into." So then just overnight, I sort of changed. And then, I was like, "Okay, I'm going to be a plastic surgeon. That's what I'm going to do." So, anyways, applied to med school, got into med school. And then, third year, I do surgery as my first rotation. And I hated surgery. I was just like, "Oh my God, this is horrible." I don't know how they could do this. So started tracking down all the different, clinical rotations and just wondering, oh gosh, I don't like anything. All of this is just, it's just not my thing. And I sort of chatted with my best friend and I said, you're just like me. Like, what are you going into? Because I know like we are really similar. And she's like, well, I'm going into anesthesiology. And I said, anesthesiology? When did you do that? I haven't had any exposure to anesthesiology. She goes, well, it was one of my 2 week electives in surgery. And I said, well, I had GYN onc and cardiac surgery, and I never saw anesthesiology. So it was already June of my third year. And so I applied for a rotation away sub internship and I got a spot at Stanford. And so I went from Boston. I was at the Boston University School of Medicine. I went from Boston to Stanford for a month to do anesthesia. And it was just one of those things like, second day, I knew, okay, I'm in the right place. I found the right people. I found the right setting. It was really funny because I kept asking the attendings, like, when are we going to round? When are we going to start our rounds? And they were like, we don't really do rounds. Like, you just pre-op your patient and you might go see a patient, the one or two patients you took care of. And I was like, there's no rounds? And they were like, no. And I'm like, I'm in. There's no rounds. So I ended up matching at Yale and training. Yeah, doing my cardiac fellowship at Yale and then staying on as a faculty member for a couple of years, and then finally made my way back to my home state of Florida at the time. And so that's how I ended up in anesthesia. And no regrets. I love it. And it's sort of ironic because I ended up back in the operating room, which is where I sort of thought I was going to be as a surgeon,
Right?
but on the other side of the curtain. And it's like it's the best side of the operating room to be in. So that was my like journey into anesthesia. So for all those people who think they want to be surgeons and then hate it, just think about anesthesiology. Yeah.
I love it. Now it's nice when you do a rotation and you realize, oh, this is my tribe, right? That's a very cool story. I
Yeah.
like it. Okay, so I will confess that I follow Dr. Conti on Twitter, and every now and then I'll notice Dr. Conti um, remarking or liking a tweet about figure skating. And I warned him, this is not like out of the blue. I warned Dr. Conti that I'm going to ask him about figure skating. What is the story behind that?
That's a very good question. So my
Do you
my
figure skate?
yeah. So my handle is LA Skater Doc. So the skater is buried in there. So
Oh
I am
yeah.
a Yeah, so I'm either sedated skater or LA skater doc. So I am a competitive figure skater. I've been skating for many, many, many years. Have competed all over the U.S., all over the world, and continue to train and compete. In fact, I'm going to compete at the U.S. Adult National Championships in Salt Lake City next week. Um, for me, it's just been one of those lifelong passions that ironically has turned into a way for me to stay healthy, both mentally and physically. And it's probably one of the few places where you really have to, quote, zone out, because when you get to the ice rink, you can't wear headsets, you're not attached to your phone. Everything just sits in a bag off the ice and you put your skates on and you go out there and train and you're literally completely absorbed in your training, in your maneuvers, in the technical artistic aspects of the sport and your music. And so it really provides me a chance to just like completely disengage, from sort of the demands of being a doctor, the demands of being a legislative advocate, and try to be an influencer, all those things. It just gives me a chance to zone out. But one of the nicest things about being a competitive figure skater is like anesthesiology, it's a very small community of people, very diverse, but we all come together on the ice and share our love and passion for skating. And I've been very privileged to be part of that community for many, many years. And for me, it's really what sustains me and keeps me sane and fit at the same time. So that's sort of the story with me on skating. And I love to skate. I love to train. It gives me a purpose. When I have competitions, I find I'm a lot more productive because I have an end goal and there's a definite deadline that I have to meet with regards to my training. You also sort of learn a lot about yourself about how, not every day is a great day. Not every day is a perfect day. And you really learn, both on the ice and off the ice that, that's just the way it is. Sort of the path forward is not a straight line. It's sort of ziggy-zaggy. But you have to sort of just keep plugging away going forward, kind of figuring out, okay, course correct, we do this next time, or this situation's not perfect, course correct. And as an anesthesiologist, that's kind of what we do. We don't always have a perfect day or the perfect setting. And so I find that so many of the things that I do as a figure skater, certainly my mental focus, my training, my discipline, my ability to cue in on things really translate to me being a better doctor in the operating room.
Yeah, yeah, I totally hear you on that. Okay, so I'm curious, did you figure skate before you went into medicine? I'm assuming you did, right?
Yeah, I skated as a kid and then, was, pretty competitive, but never really Olympic level because that's like, you have to be basically super fantastic. But then when I went to college and med school and residency, I stopped skating. And then literally, like, I think the month after I graduated from residency and fellowship, I was like, okay, I'm making a salary again and I can start figure skating and buy a new pair of skates and,
Right.
start taking some private lessons. So yeah, so I've been skating for a long time. Yeah.
That's very cool. I agree with you. I feel like sports are sort of like a microcosm of life, or like, it's like a constant life lesson. You just get so much out of it aside from just the sport itself almost, So it's very cool. I wanted to ask you, when you started it, because I feel like I'm like a total like tennis nut. I love playing tennis. I mean, I run a lot too, and that's what got me through residency. Actually, just sort of like running every day, and that was like my zen moment. But I sort of feel like in tennis, I have so little ability to execute, which is probably not what's happening with you in figure skating. But I was thinking, when I'm in the intensive care unit, because I'm an ICU specialist, or when I'm in the OR, and I have to get this difficult intubation, or I have to get the subclavian, you know what? I always get it. But that is so not true in tennis, and I'm like, gosh, if I could just be like even 10% in tennis what I do as an anesthesiologist and critical care specialist, I would be so good. Anyways, so that's just my side note.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point. So I think, well, first of all, we often forget that we practice medicine, 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And so much of what we do is just built into our muscle memory, and we can do it at any time. But, I look at athletes, Olympic athletes, world-class athletes in the performance sports. So like swimming, I mean, diving, gymnastics, figure skating. There's a huge mental element to being a performance type athlete when your entire event is over in 10 seconds or 2 minutes. You don't have any chance to recover. It's not a football game that lasts 2 hours. You have to do it on the first time. And even athletes who train 6 hours, 8 hours a day, that's all they do, that's their life, and then they literally quote peak at the Olympics or the World Championships. They don't often deliver perfect performances. They're oftentimes, just they're not perfect. They've missed a jump, or they actually fell, or they missed a spin, or what have you. And so it is, what's the word, to put it in perspective, it's a humbling endeavor, and part of why I love is it kind of keeps me humble, but also it kind of keeps you coming back because you always want to strive to be better. And I think about that as a doctor. Part of why I go to work is to take care of my patients. And every day I try to be a little better. I feel like, as I'm almost 60 now, I feel like I'm just hitting my stride because every day I feel like I'm just getting better and better and better. And it's sort of the same thing on the ice. It's different. Obviously, I can't do the types of jumps that I used to do in my 30s, but on other levels, like I feel like I'm still getting better and better and faster and stronger. And so, I think you just have to put things in perspective. Performance sports are very different, but there is an aspect to being an anesthesiologist. What we do, it's a performance. Everybody's watching us. You only have a few minutes to get the intubation or, to
Yes.
resuscitate the patient. And
Right.
so, I always joke that my life has been defined by these 4 minutes on the ice, skating, or like literally 4 minutes until something bad may happen to my patient if I don't intervene within that 4 minutes. You always hear that,
Hmm.
oh my God, my whole life is on this 4 minute timeline. Like if I don't perform within 4 minutes, bad things happen. But that's sort of just the frame of reference.
I like it. Very true. And thank you for sharing that. I really respect that. I can't imagine how you've managed to do that at such a high level and, going to the US Championship. So, number one, have a great time. And number two, good luck on that. Um, let's go back to something slightly more serious and we'll talk about the CSA. So, I wanted to ask you about your upcoming CSA presidency and what your biggest goals are and hopes for the for your time as the boss.
Wow. Yeah. So, first of all, I'm so, humbled and privileged to be the next president for the CSA. And we're celebrating our 75th Jubilee, 75 years of being, an amazing anesthesiology specialty organization.
That's right.
And so many great leaders have come before me. So, shout out to all those people and, thank you so much for everything they've done. So, I think the challenges that,
Here, here.
our organization faces right now, like many other organizations, whether they be in business or law, is sort of declining membership. The world has changed and the way we interface and interact with each other is a lot different. And a lot of the face to face meetings that really used to be the big touch points for us as physicians to sort of connect aren't really as necessary, or they're certainly not as important as they used to be, like back when I was in training in the 90s. So I think, as the next CSA president, I will certainly continue to focus on, you know, sustaining our members and, improving our membership base and really trying to figure out what it is that we can do for them so that they want to be members. Like what kind of resources or services do they need that, demonstrate value, that make it worth their while for them to join. But also too, I think the thing that's harder, to figure out, which is sort of that X question is, what do our anesthesiologists practicing today need to sort of feel like they're sustained and part of a community of people that, in the state of California, we have, the largest population in the United States. We're geographically massive, culturally very diverse. Our practice settings are extremely, extremely diverse, and we work really hard. So, how can we bring everybody together, whether they be, in more regional type meetings, seminars, points of engagement, social activities? What can we do that sort of makes us feel more interconnected again? Because we're really finally emerging from the pandemic, and I think people are finally starting to come out, of their houses and their hospitals and seek, you know, that human touch again. And I think that'll be a big part of my role as the next CSA president is try to figure out how to engage everyone and build that anesthesia community, because that's a really, really important part of our coming together, just sort of socializing, touching base, saying, hey, I'm having some problems on this, or, I'm looking for some answers on that. Like, I'd love to hear your side of things, or even if it's just to, just commiserate or share and celebrate things. I think those are really important things that we've been lacking in the last few years during the pandemic. Um, Legislatively, we always have a large slew
I
of,
think those are great goals. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, we always have a lot of things. So, there's going to be no shortage of work that needs to be done. So I'm looking forward to tackling all of it.
Not to sort of put you on the spot immediately, but talking about how to make the CSA, sort of like the broad church for the disparate practitioners that we have all over the states and their different needs, and trying to get them to feel more connected. Do you have any particular plans in mind already, or is this something that you're going to work on once you assume the presidency?
There are some new programming sort of initiatives that we're already starting to lay the groundwork for. We are already rethinking the way we handle some of our meetings. How might we better, repurpose existing meetings and make them more specialty focused or really more user friendly, and just I think more cost effective, so you don't have to travel as far. So we're already working on a number of things, and there's a large team from the Educational Program Development Committee who really tackles these things. There's a large committee from practice management who are looking for areas where we can better serve our practicing physicians, and certainly on the legislative front, we're super busy on that. So a lot of the stuff is already sort of in evolution. It's just a matter of rolling it out, timing, the implementation of it. And I don't want to reveal any secrets, but there's a lot of really great stuff coming along. So stay tuned for more on the email blasts as we launch new projects and initiatives in 2023 and 2024.
It sounds like people would just have to keep on paying attention to all the various CSA happenings. So I think that's great. Yeah, thanks for that. One last thing before I let you go. This has been such a wonderful conversation. So thank you for that. I wanted to make sure that I asked you if there were any topics that we did not cover so far that you really wanted our audience to come away from this with?
Well, I think probably the biggest thing is that, the California Society of Anesthesiologists really values and appreciates everybody's voice. And, a lot of times people are sort of afraid to just raise their hand and say something because maybe what they're thinking and what they're going to say might not be in alignment with, quote, the majority. And, if people feel that way, I really want to dispel that truth. I think, the California Society of Anesthesiologists is probably one of the most inclusive and embracing organizations that exists in the United States. And so we want to hear your voice. We want to hear the good. We want to hear the bad. We want to hear the ugly. And, one of my sort of big things is that I don't usually surround myself with the people who are going to tell me what I want to hear. I surround myself with people who tell me things that I either don't hear or the things that I need to hear and haven't heard before. So if I can leave everyone with that simple message is that, speak up, let your voice be heard, because one voice can make a world of a difference. And so, I challenge everybody to be that voice and, most importantly, to be true to themselves and, speak on behalf of themselves, their patients, their hospitals, and their communities.
I love that. Thank you so much for saying that. So hear you on that. We need to be a voice. We need to all help ourselves build a really amazing future for the anesthesiologists and for anesthesiologists in California. So it's wonderful to hear your thoughts about all of that and to really get an idea of what is happening at the Capitol in terms of issues affecting anesthesiologists and physicians. And it's also really nice to just hear about your personal path in medicine. So, Dr. Conte, thank you for all that. To our audience, thanks for taking the time to listen, participate, stay engaged, and also keep on listening to the Vital Times the podcast series and subscribe. And with that, we will conclude this edition of the podcast series. Thanks for listening. This is Ludwig Lin.